Hello, and thank you for joining us for this virtual advocacy workshop relating to Texas marijuana policy. My name is Heather Fazio. I'm the director of Texans for Responsible Marijuana Policy, which is a broad coalition of organizations and individuals working together on an issue upon which we agree, marijuana law reform. We work with folks that span the political spectrum, demonstrating that this issue is not about politics, it's about people and the real lives that are impacted by marijuana prohibition. Let's go ahead and get started. Okay, so I have worked together with Jax, the director of the Foundation for an Informed Texas, who also works with Texas Normal, for several years, 5 years, I think. We've been working together, hosting annual series of events throughout the state of Texas, bringing this information to the hundreds and thousands of people throughout our state that do want to see these laws changed. We've shifted gears and are hosting this event virtually for obvious reasons. We wanted to make sure that we could provide a safe and inclusive event so that as many people as possible throughout our state have this information and the empowerment to move forward with having conversations with lawmakers, with decision makers at the state and the local level. As I mentioned, we work with folks that span the political spectrum. Here you see hundreds of Texans coming together at our Texas Capitol to advocate for reform. Just after this photo was taken, we all hit the halls of the Capitol and visited our legislators to have the conversations about our personal or professional experience that brings us to the opinion that we have to reform our laws in Texas. These are some of the organizations that we are proud to work with. Folks that may not agree on everything, but what we're seeing is especially important in these times of political polarization is really focusing on the issues upon which we agree. We work on direct action, helping people take their position on this issue directly to policymakers. So organizing lobby days, helping to facilitate meaningful testimony at the Capitol. We host educational exhibits and policy briefings. And direct action that allows people like you an opportunity to come to the Capitol, even if you're not familiar with the process or the building, get yourself acquainted and engage in the process. This is one of our educational exhibits I mentioned a moment ago. We reserve the hallway down in the extension of our Texas Capitol to display all of the good information and all the good reasons why Texas should move forward with reform. Let's talk about our political timeline as we make our way forward. Coming up is a deadline for registering to vote. If you are not already registered, please be sure to do that. We'll talk more about how to do that in just a bit. Then moving on, we have early voting and then election day on November 3rd. We know that the president is up for election. Obviously, that's getting a lot of attention, but every congressional member is up for election. Every member of the Texas House of Representatives is up for election, and half of the Texas Senate is up for election. The other half will be up during the next cycle in 2022, when the governor and lieutenant governor are up for election. Shortly after Election Day on November 3rd, we see pre-filing happening on November 9th. This is a day when lawmakers can start introducing legislation for consideration when the legislature convenes formally on January 12th. We have a 140-day period, which Jax is going to talk about, how we can take a bill and get it introduced, get it considered, and get it passed. Our deadline for doing that is May 31st. That's when they adjourn. There are some caveats and contingency plans considering the uncertainty that we're facing with large public gatherings like meeting at the Capitol. Jax is going to talk a little bit more about that and how we are going to remain agile so that we can be effective. So we'll start with Cannabis 101, talk about some of the vocabulary and vernacular when it comes to cannabis. We'll talk about federal policy, we'll talk about the Texas Hemp program, as well as decriminalization, legalization, and our Texas Compassionate Use program. I'll talk more about the general election, and then we'll close up with some action items and what to prepare for as we make our way toward the 2021 legislative session. I'd like to introduce Jax Finkel. She is the Executive Director of the Foundation for an Informed Texas. She's been working on this issue diligently for many years and has been instrumental in the progress that we've made in Texas. Welcome, Jax.
Hello. Hi, everybody. Thanks for having me, Heather. I appreciate the introduction. And I am going to be starting off talking about Cannabis 101. But first, what I wanted to do was actually chat with you guys about some of the opportunities you're going to have to ask questions during this event. If you look down below, you're going to see a Q&A opportunity for you. Make sure that if you have any questions, you drop them there, and we will circle back with you on them and make sure we get them answered. We also have a document we're going to make available to you with a bunch of informational links. Some of the things that we're talking about, we're giving a very high-level overview, and we want to make sure that you can really dig in as much as you want. And they'll be broken down by the sections, just like we did here for our presentation today. So first, let me start my slides here. All right. So Cannabis 101, there is a lot to learn about cannabis. First, let's talk about the different strains and types of cannabis, right? So we've got 3 different cannabis categories. The overarching plant is known as Cannabis sativa L, and it has 3 general varieties. You've got Cannabis sativa and Cannabis indica, which tend to be some of your medical applications or perhaps something that you would get at a retail market. And then you've got Cannabis ruderalis, which is a plant that is grown specifically for fiber, for seed as well. And so these are the different categories that we know cannabis to be under. Now, because they are all kind of the same plant, they are able to do some crossbreeding. So that brings us to talking about how do we describe all of these different cultivars of cannabis. So cultivar is just, short for a cultivated variety, and it talks about, the breed type, the strain, some of the identifying traits of it visually. But then you've got chemovar, and that's more of a chemical profile of the plant, talking about the terpenes, we're talking about cannabinoids, the potencies, any biomolecules like lipids or waxes, those will all be included in that chemovar description. So I've said a lot of words, and one of them was cannabinoids. Cannabinoids is a group of compounds like CBD, THC, CBG, CBN. These are all short acronyms for very long molecular words, and they are what give the active constituents or the active components to cannabis. In addition, you heard me use the word terpenes. I've got this lovely wheel graph here from Leafly that kind of breaks down some of the terpenes and their traits. But what a terpene is it's kind of like an essential oil. It gives you the aroma of the plant, but it also does have bioavailability and uptakes along with some of the cannabinoids, and it has therapeutic effects. You might be familiar with like limonene. That is going to have a very citrusy smell. Caryophyllene might have more of like a peppery smell, and pinene, of course, smells like pine. So these are some of the constituents that give the aroma and also some therapeutic benefits to the plant. So your body has an endocannabinoid system, and it runs throughout most of your body. And what it does is it helps bring homeostasis to these different body systems. There are receptors present all throughout the body, and they receive these different endocannabinoids, which are from inside your body. Yes, your body creates cannabinoids. So then you've got cannabinoids from the plant, which can come and help bring homeostasis if perhaps your endocannabinoid system is not totally unbalanced. There are actually believed to be more receptors for the endocannabinoid system than any other system in the body. So it's something that we don't fully understand yet, but we are starting to get even more detailed information about this system of the body. So let's talk about different forms. You'll see the flower. That's, of course, a dried flower. So they are going to harvest the plant, hang it to dry, prune it so that it's just the flower bud, and that is going to be the dried flower right there. Then you'll see in the middle topicals, which is going to be where the extracted cannabis cannabinoids or terpenes are going to be blended with some sort of salve, maybe a coconut oil, shea butter. There's a lot of different mixtures that you can do for that. Then you've got concentrates on the right. These are just the cannabinoids condensed down from the plant. It's the resins of the plant. And they come in different kind of textures. So you've got shatter and wax and all of these different nicknames for it, but basically it's a concentrated form of the cannabis plant. Then you'll see on the bottom tinctures. These are going to be drops that you'll put usually under your tongue. And then you've got your traditional edibles or consumables. You might drink it, you might have a brownie. That's probably what you're most used to seeing there. So all of these different forms of cannabis have different uptake methods. So when I was talking about the tincture and dropping it under your tongue, that's oral mucosal absorption, and it goes through the lining of the mouth, and the effects are felt throughout the entire body. Then you have the ingestion or the eating of the brownie, and those molecules are going to be absorbed through the intestinal tract and metabolized through the liver, and so that'll have a different impact on your body, usually a little bit longer time to feel the effect. Then you've got inhalation, which can be vaporization or combustion. That usually has a very quick impact, very quick uptake. And then you've got transdermal. You might use a patch or a salve for it to go through your skin. Usually that's a very located type of method that you would use. All right, so let's chat quickly about federal policy. There is a lot going on at the federal level in so many different arenas, and cannabis is definitely one of them. And so I want to talk about some of the important points for us to understand about federal policy. So first, let's talk about scheduling. So cannabis sativa with 0.3% THC or more is considered a Schedule I drug. So this is the most restrictive category. It's considered dangerous, high potential for addiction, physiological and physical dependence, but we find that typically that is not the case for the safety profile, but these are the current regulatory requirements that are in place for Schedule I drugs. So there's two different conversations. Do you want to reschedule or move it to a different scheduling, a lower schedule, or do you just totally deschedule it and remove it from the CSA, which is the Controlled Substance Act? There are some benefits, some pros and cons to each. I think that rescheduling, it doesn't really properly represent the plant's safety profile compared to some other drugs or pharmaceuticals that are out there. And it also leaves regulatory hurdles in place that limit the ability to conduct research. It fails to protect states from federal interference, but it does allow for the FDA to oversee and regulate this for medicinal purposes. Now, if we move to descheduling, that means it completely decouples cannabis from the war on drugs and treats it like the plant and the therapeutic properties that it is. It allows for private companies to do testing. It would allow for FDA-approved trials, bringing new products to market. So there are a lot of people who tend to lean to the descheduling of cannabis as the preferred method to move forward with changing that. So there's also restrictions on the Department of Justice's funding. So there has been an appropriations bill amendment that has been authored for quite a few years that basically makes it where the DOJ, the Department of Justice, can't spend any money on preventing states or territories from implementing their own laws. So if you decide that you want to have a medical program in your state, that is fully within your rights, and the federal government cannot come in and tell you what to do in regards to those programs. But there are a lot of restraints on research at the federal level, unfortunately. Because there are some conflict between state and federal laws, this has really inhibited some scientists' ability to legally obtain marijuana for research. So cannabis researchers have to get approval from 3 federal agencies, and funding is pretty limited. In fact, many applications through the DEA have been left, in fact, all I think it is, have been left pending since they started. In 2016, there was a lawsuit with Dr. Sue Sisley regarding that. So hopefully we'll see some movement in that arena. They also, these applicants also have to comply with the international treaty, the Single Convention on Narcotic Drugs. In addition to that, most of these studies use synthetic formulations as opposed to plant-based extracts. And one of the problems with this is that you can't look at the whole plant necessarily and how they synergistically work together. So there have also not been any clinical studies from cannabis products from legal markets. So cannabis products let's say from Texas, from the Texas Compassionate Use Program, those are not included in the types of substances that can be used for research. In fact, it's very restricted by NIDA. University of Mississippi is the only current place that you can get cannabis to research. And there's been complaints for years from researchers about the quality, the potency, and other issues with the cannabis that's being grown at the University of Mississippi. So it would be very important for these researchers to be able to actually research on the products that patients are using, as opposed to this less than ideal product from the University of Mississippi. So there are some current research items going on across the world, in America and locally. Of course, they kind of vary on the content of what they're addressing. Israel has actually been at the forefront of cannabis research for many years. And the Israeli chemist and professor, Dr. Raphael Mechoulam, he actually discovered THC and CBD in the early 1960s. He's continued researching these plants for these many decades, and now he and some researchers have revealed that they've created a way of stabilizing the acids within the living cannabis plant. And so that's going to make sure that we can have better That's going to make sure that we have better shelf-stable products and medicines for patients in the future. In addition to that, the Scottsdale Research Institute and Dr. Sue Sisley, who I mentioned earlier, are conducting controlled trials of smoked and vaporized cannabis, attempting to move whole plant flower through the FDA drug development process, which is a heavy lift because the FDA process is a lengthy one to begin with. So I'm very hopeful that we'll have some results from that. Then also one of the local licensed medical growers, Compassionate Cultivation and Fluence, who is a LED lighting industry leader, they have teamed up together in Austin, and they are gathering new insights on sustainable cannabis production using different lighting and different techniques there. So that's going to be some interesting results that we'll be able to hear about from them. So let's talk about the VA directive. So the VA in 2011 gave guidance to doctors on how to handle their patients that are participating in a program. They clarified that if you're in a state program, you cannot be denied VHA services. So that's very important. In addition, it protected VA providers it prohibited them from completing forms seeking recommendations or opinions, but rather they were able to put it under non-VA medicine section, and they were able to make notes of it that way. So it gave them guidance. However, I will note that this has expired. While that doesn't mean that they don't have to do it any longer, it might be a good idea for us to perhaps renew that memo. So I'm going to transition now to discussing hemp. And just a reminder, if you have questions, make sure that you're dropping them in the Q&A section. And I am going to start by, I want to say start at the beginning, but it's not the beginning. We all know that hemp and cannabis have been around for millennia, but the recent history for cannabis or for hemp started in 2014. They created at the federal level a farm bill which defined industrial hemp, made it distinct from illicit marijuana, but this distinction was based on THC content. So 0.3% THC or less is qualified as hemp and is a legal product. And their goal was also to create these pilot programs where institutions of higher learning could team up with businesses, and they would grow hemp and create these products and research these potential hemp industries and products and different opportunities. Now, the farmers who participated in the 2014 Farm Bill, they had to be certified by and registered with the State Department of Agriculture, and they also had to be registered with that research entity, that entity of higher education. So from 2014 to 2018, there were 16 states that implemented programs underneath the 2014 Farm Bill. Unfortunately, Texas was not one of them. However, in 2018, there was a new Farm Bill, and it amended the Controlled Substance Act and now formally removed hemp plants as being classified as a Schedule I drug. And then it maintained that same pilot program from 2014 that they could do it for another year before they had to come into compliance with the 2018 Farm Bill regulations. It further removed hemp from the jurisdiction of the Justice Department and actually moved it to the USDA. States that didn't want to have to fall under the USDA regulations had to create their own program and submit it to USDA for approval. So that's where we come to Texas. So the Texas timeline was after the bill passed in December of 2018. In March of 2019, the Texas Department of Health and Human Services, known as DSHS, amended the Texas Schedule of Controlled Substances to also remove hemp because they have to reflect the same as the federal within a certain timeline. Then in June of 2019, a basically unanimous hemp farming bill, HB 1325, passed through both chambers, made it to the governor, and was passed into law. He signed it on June 10th of 2019. So by 2020 of this year, January 2020, USDA approved our program. TDA and others had put together thoughtful regulations, what they wanted to do for the program. They submitted it to USDA and it was approved. March of 2020, TDA officially adopted their rules regarding growing hemp. So now we have hemp licensed farmers growing hemp here in Texas. I actually had the opportunity to speak with Commissioner Miller this weekend and discuss just how many different licenses and how many acres are being grown in Texas. And it's great. We have a lot of work to do to make the program work a little bit better for farmers, but it's definitely a great start for that. Then in July of this year, DSHS released final rules regarding consumable hemp products. Manufacturers can now apply for their license, and coming soon we'll have retail licensing for those that are selling these products in Texas to make sure that they are also properly licensed through the state. So the program has, maybe issues isn't the right word, but it has created some things that we've had to become aware of and start to work towards. And one of these is THC testing. You know, you can't distinguish legal hemp from illegal marijuana by sight because it's based on a percentage of a chemical compound that's inside of the plant. In fact, it's the only agricultural commodity that is regulated in that way whenever we're talking about hemp. And it can be expensive testing, several $100s, if not more, depending on where you have to send it. Many labs don't have the equipment. In fact, here in Texas, we only had a couple labs that were actually at the right level to be able to do this very detailed, you know, to the 100th percentage point testing of THC, or I'm sorry, to the 10th. So following that, the big three and which are known as, let me just clarify, the big three are the Speaker of the House, the Lieutenant Governor, and the Governor. And then along with the Attorney General, they announced, well, if law enforcement finds someone, you know, with a hemp product in their car, they can still, and they don't have the proper certification, they can write a civil penalty of up to $500 and levy that against that person. Some localities, because of these complications and the expense, are deciding to defund or reallocate those funds elsewhere and not spend it on THC testing and protocols. And some jurisdictions have actually called for the stopping of arrest and prosecution for personal possession of cannabis because it's just quite simply, it wasn't financially efficacious before, and it's definitely not now. We also have the smokable hemp ban. So DSHS has rules that explicitly prohibit the manufacture, processing, distribution, and retail sale. Now, in the statute, it only says the manufacturing and processing. It did not include retail sales. So there was a lot of issues with businesses here about that. So what do they define as smoking? What is a smokable hemp product? Basically anything that's marketed or designed for burning, igniting, vaping, any kind of hemp product. So these will be like pre-rolls, also known as hempettes, which how cute is that? And also known as, you know, cartridges. These type of things would not be allowed to be sold. We know from the statute they can't be manufactured, but this would have been an additional regulation that they could not also be sold. let me just be clear, this does not include loose flower, because loose flower can be used for cooking for so many different things. So the fix for this, if you will, is that some businesses are actually suing the state. And I think we'll also need to have a legislative correction. But just so to give a brief update on the lawsuit that's going on, there is a temporary injunction against the state to temporarily suspend the prohibition of selling smokable products. That temporary injunction will be in place until February 2nd, when the next hearing is, unless other unforeseen occurrences. So as of right now, it is still technically legal, in my understanding, to sell these smokable items, and the lawsuit next step will be in February. So very interested to see how that proceeds. So let me go ahead and stop my screen share and invite Heather back up here with me. I am going to pass it over to you, Heather.
Thanks, Jax. Thank you, thank you. Let's talk about marijuana possession, current penalties, and decriminalization. So first, just to kind of review some of what Jax has talked about, cannabis that has 0.3% THC or less is considered hemp and is completely legal to possess and consume in the state of Texas. However, cannabis that has above 0.3% THC is considered marijuana. And you'll notice it has an H. It's spelled phonetically rather than how it is supposed to be spelled in our statute. So that is not my typo. That is actually how it is presented in the statutes for the state of Texas. Now, our current laws are harsh and unreasonable. You could be facing up to 6 months in jail and $2,000 in fines for even a small amount of cannabis, and up to 2 ounces. Between 2 and 4 ounces bumps up to a year in jail and $4,000 in fines. And then we have 4 ounces or more of the flower stepping into the felony category. And something even more alarming is that concentrated products, whether it's a vape pen, a tincture, or an infused edible, those are all considered concentrated products, and any amount of a concentrated product is considered a felony in Texas. This is incredibly unreasonable, and thankfully this issue is getting attention. People are starting to talk about it so we can move forward, but it is something that we have to be aware of. So many people don't think that these things are that big of a deal, and frankly they shouldn't be, but our laws are so harsh and unreasonable that we have to make sure that we know and understand the law, and that way people can operate within that or choose to take their own risks should they need to do that. So in Texas, we generally arrest, over the years, we have arrested between 60 and 70,000 people. It fluctuates annually. This is tens of thousands of people who are being arrested, prosecuted, and according to DPS, 2/3 of them will be convicted, meaning that they're going to carry collateral consequences for that permanent criminal record for a lifetime. This has hindered access to education, employment, housing, driver's license suspension. These are what we call collateral consequences. So let's look at the penalties and the consequences that we've got and some of the proposals for decriminalization that we've seen. So here on this chart, you'll see the penalty and collateral consequence column where we talk about the fines, the arrests, the jail time, the permanent criminal record, driver's license suspended. Another thing that I find to be particularly abhorrent is the suspension of your right to defend yourself, your license to carry, suspended for 7 years. You don't even have to be convicted to have that privilege, which should be a right, but is considered a privilege. But even upon the accusation of possession of marijuana at a Class B level, can have your license to carry suspended for 7 years. There's court-appointed attorneys that come in with a Class B misdemeanor. We'll talk more about that in just a minute. But your financial aid can be affected, your ability to serve in the military, naturalization, housing, professional licensing, whether it's nursing or becoming a lawyer. All of these types of collateral consequences come along with the current law, the Class B misdemeanor. So there, you go over to the two right columns. We see two approaches to reform. Now, we've been working with Representative Moody, who has been a tremendous leader on this issue. He himself is a former prosecutor. He's now the Speaker Pro Tem, so second in leadership of the Texas House of Representatives. And he, again, has been such a champion on this because he knows directly how these laws not only affect the lives of people who use cannabis, but also of the criminal justice system and the burden that it places on the courts. So his approach has been to institute a civil penalty. This would allow for a fine, but you wouldn't be arrested. There'd be no jail time associated, and you would have, because you avoid a criminal record, because it's a civil offense, not a criminal offense, you avoid all of the lasting consequences, including a driver's license suspension. And it's important to note that a driver's license will be suspended whether you were in, near, or around a vehicle at the time of your arrest or your citation. This is something that happens automatically, and it's because of federal transportation dollars that are tied to the federal prohibition. So Representative Moody wanted to find a way around all these consequences and had the civil penalty approach. He earned tremendous support in the Texas House, and but we know that he is also willing to work with his colleagues on both sides of the aisle. And so there were other people pushing for a Class C misdemeanor. This would be better than a Class B, but not quite as good as a civil penalty. So let's look at the impact that a Class C misdemeanor would have. The fine would be $500, so certainly less than a $2,000, which is good. You can still be arrested for a Class C misdemeanor, though. Right? Of course, it's the discretion of the officer, but I think we're going to still see some of the communities that are particularly disproportionately impacted by these laws continue to be impacted negatively when that discretion is in place to arrest people for simple possession of marijuana. One of the benefits to a Class C misdemeanor, though, is that there's no jail time associated. So your penalty is a fine, and then once you pay your fine, you have your criminal record. So that is one of the downfalls of this approach, is that even though you don't go to jail, there's no jail time associated with it other than the initial arrest. You do still end up with a permanent criminal record for a drug offense. So even though it's a Class C misdemeanor like a speeding ticket, because it's a drug conviction, it still carries significant collateral consequences, as you see here. Another negative to this approach is that with Class C misdemeanors, there is no right to a court-appointed attorney. So those who can't afford an attorney may be looking at their charges, say, I'll pay my $500 fine, and not realize that they're going to be saddled with a criminal record for the rest of their lives. So this approach has pros and cons. And so we've been working alongside Representative Moody to find a way forward. During this process, and we'll talk a little bit about what passed out of the House during the last legislative session, but first I want to talk about local enforcement. And, you know, local law enforcement officers, district attorneys, they know the weight that these convictions carry for individuals. And they know that people with criminal records are more inclined to recidivism, to ending up back into the system. That's kind of the nature of our system and how it works. It's very difficult to get out once you get sucked in. And so some of the objectives of local law enforcement, led mostly by district attorneys, is to mitigate the harm caused by the bad state law and to preserve their valuable public safety resources. So most recently, we saw Austin take a big leap in this. They did the most far-reaching approach of non-enforcement for misdemeanor levels of flower and small amounts of concentrate. And that's what makes this the most far-reaching, is that they also included concentrate. So somebody who has a vape pen is not going to be arrested, because we know that the DA isn't taking those charges. It was, you know, arrests for about a year were punitive. The officers knew the DA wasn't going to take the charges and arrested people anyway. That is unreasonable, and I'm thankful to have seen the community rally behind the council members leading the charge to instruct APD to no longer enforce these laws. Now, again, that's the most recent and far-reaching. Over the years, we have seen more and more district and county attorneys adopting diversion programs or first-time offender programs. We have programs instituted in Dallas, El Paso, Houston was one of the very first, thanks to the leadership, first under Republican leadership and now under a Democrat. We see this isn't a partisan issue. It's what's right for Harris County, and that's why they're doing it there. San Antonio has a program, Corpus Christi, Fort Worth is working on a program now, as well as Denton. We see activists getting in there, building relationships with local city council members and helping to advance these local initiatives. So one thing that's important to note is that cite and summons, or cite and release as it's commonly talked about, is a good thing, meaning that people aren't initially arrested. This went into effect in 2007, but was very rarely used. And now we're seeing these other types of diversion programs in place, but cite and summons is still an option. The downfall to that is, while the benefit is that you don't get arrested right in the moment, you get issued a citation, you also get issued a summons, and you have to go to court, and you have to not only pay the fines and the cost of legal defense, but if you are convicted after all of that, you still face the lifetime of collateral consequences because of the conviction. So keep in mind that just because your area is instituting cite and summons does not mean that people aren't being punitively harmed by these laws. And then, we also have the issue of testing, which Jack's talked about, the issue with hemp being legal. When you look at cannabis, you can't tell by the smell or the look of it, whether it's legal or illegal. So it's creating challenges and creating more of an incentive for local law enforcement to create these kinds of programs, again, to help mitigate the harm and preserve their valuable public safety resources. So in spite of all of these efforts done at the local level and the change of minds that is happening locally, we still saw 45,000 people arrested in 2019. Now that's better than 2018. We saw 63,000 people arrested. However, this is still 45,000 people who are being drugged into the criminal justice system needlessly, and 2/3 of them will end up with a criminal record, according to DPS. This is completely unacceptable and demonstrates why we need statewide reform. Further, we saw a recent report out of San Antonio that showed that they're still arresting 65% of people, even when they have the option to issue citations. And an alarming report came out of Dallas recently. 90% of those arrested for marijuana possession or cited were Black or Hispanic. It means that they basically stopped arresting white people. We know that certain communities, minority communities, poor communities are disproportionately affected by these laws, and we're seeing those terrible effects still in place, even with these changes being made in places like Dallas. Again, reiterating why we need statewide reform. Governor Abbott has come to our side on this issue. Now, he's not he's not out there rallying in the streets like many activists, but he was public during a debate during the last election cycle, saying that he doesn't want to see our jails stockpiled with people for marijuana possession. I think that's the right approach. We don't need to be arresting people. We don't need to be jailing them. And I think that it's important for people like him and people like us to be having the continued conversation about taking it a step further and helping people avoid the criminal convictions as well. So let's talk about what passed last year during the legislative session in 2019. Representative Moody worked with his colleagues on both sides of the aisle to find a way to come together, find that common ground, and agree on legislation, and he did just that. He worked on a bill that was a Class C misdemeanor approach for up to 1 ounce of marijuana. And he created provisions, though, that helped us to achieve the objectives of no arrest, no jail time, no criminal record. So let me just say, first of all, that everything in Texas is arrestable, with the exception of 3 offenses: speeding, open container, and texting and driving. Those are the 3 offenses that are not arrestable, and the only reason they're not arrestable is because it's explicitly written into the law. Representative Moody's bill would have added low-level marijuana possession to that list, making small amounts of marijuana something that a person could not be arrested for. Being a Class C misdemeanor, there's no jail time associated, and the fines are lower. The other key component, coming back to the criminal record, because as we talked about, a Class C misdemeanor for marijuana possession is still a criminal drug offense that triggers collateral consequences. To help mitigate some of this harm, the approach is to make it a little bit more like a speeding ticket with an opportunity to take a drug education course to have a case dismissed. So a person would be able to do this once a year. If you get in trouble for marijuana possession, you take a drug education course or do community service, whatever the judge prescribes. And after you complete that, your case is dismissed. This allows you to keep a clean record, to continue going to school, to continue supporting your family, and being a productive member of your community. So this was an approach that advocates could have come to agreement on, that lawmakers came to agreement on, and we saw bipartisan supermajority support in the Texas House. Sadly, once it made it to the Senate, leadership there shut it down without even allowing a debate. So while we do have to make sure that we shore up support in the House, we have work to do in the Senate so that in 2021, we can get this policy passed. So here we've talked about some of our objectives. We want no arrest, no jail time, and no criminal record for small amounts of marijuana. Last legislative session, we saw a record number of marijuana bills introduced. We saw 63, I think was the exact number, various proposals. So I imagine that there will be that kind of tremendous support. Again, this legislative session, we're only growing in numbers and in momentum. And so we have objectives that we want to see with whatever legislation it advances. And again, one more time, that's no arrest, no criminal record, and most importantly, we want to keep people out from doing jail time. There are 27 states plus Washington, D.C. that have instituted policies like this, and wouldn't you know it, the sky hasn't fallen. In fact, we've seen very positive results from that, and I think that Texas should do the same. So let's shift gears and talk about the compassionate use program for a moment. We have a very restrictive medical cannabis program, if you want to call it that. We have a program that allows very limited access to low THC cannabis. We've talked about hemp is cannabis at 0.3% THC. What the compassionate use program does is allow certain patients access to 0.5% THC. That's 0.2 of a percentage point more THC than what they can get over the counter without having to go to a specialist and register in this program. So it's arguably even relevant at this point. Now, we do see about 2,500 patients throughout the state of Texas participating. Of course, there are many more that could benefit if we bring Texas on par with the 33 states across the country that allow safe and legal access. And so that's what we intend to do. But this program was initially enacted in 2015. And it was expanded in 2019 thanks to the tremendous advocates who have been working diligently to share their professional or personal experiences, whether it's caregivers coming in to talk about loved ones who need access to this medicine, patients themselves being self-advocates and coming to the Capitol explaining what their day-to-day life is, the medicines that they're taking, the side effects that they suffer from, and how cannabis is a viable alternative for them, especially those living with conditions like pain, where people are prescribed opiates that we know to be dangerous and addictive. These personal stories are making a significant impact in the way that lawmakers look at medical cannabis and the seriousness with which they come to the table to have the conversation. So let's look at some of the qualifying conditions. We talked about dosing being restricted to 0.5% THC, but there are no restrictions on any of the other cannabinoids or the terpenes. This is really beneficial because all of those elements of the plant do have medicinal value. Patients that would qualify would be all epileptic conditions and seizure disorders. Multiple sclerosis and spasticity are now qualifying conditions. Terminal cancer and incurable neurodegenerative diseases like the conditions of Alzheimer's, Parkinson's, Huntington's disease. We actually saw the legislature leave a bit of discretion to the Department of State Health Services in defining what is an incurable neurodegenerative disorder. And to our surprise, DSHS did a tremendous job, and they listed over 100 specific conditions and symptoms that would qualify a patient to participate in the compassionate use program. Autism was included as well as ALS. Just a note that mothers advocating medical marijuana for autism were such tremendous advocates in getting autism included as a condition. And I know they continue to do their work to work on the dosing aspect of this, because THC, again, is a very therapeutic component of the plant. But I'll tell you, moms getting into the Capitol and fighting and standing up for their families, it's just such a powerful experience that lawmakers really can't deny. So to keep that in mind, that when we keep it personal and we speak from our hearts, we can help to really advance this cause. Some other notes on this program: there are 3 licensed dispensaries, and while there are only 3 physical locations, they are able to deliver, and they've started to open up satellite areas for pickup in the different regions of the state. But there is a limited list of participating physicians available on the website, making it a bit of a challenge for patients to find a doctor who's willing to participate, which is a challenge, and we'll get into that in just a moment. So under the current program, physicians have to be a specialist in the area that the patient, in the condition that the patient suffers from. And the Department of Public Safety is tasked with regulating this program. We certainly would have preferred to see the Department of Health or another health-related agency managing the program. But DPS, while there have been some bumps in the road, the good people at DPS have wanted to see this program get up and running, and they did just that in getting the Texas Compassionate Use Registry up and running and helping these businesses to start actually operating. I mentioned that there are 3 licensed businesses in Texas, and they have to be vertically integrated. It means that they have to cultivate, manufacture, and process and dispense the medicine all within their operation. These businesses have had to pay a great cost to have one of these first 3 licenses. In fact, it was almost $500,000 for the first 2 years of licensure. And keep in mind that back then, when they first got their license, it was only for patients with intractable epilepsy. So they had an even smaller market of patients to sell to, and they had to pay the highest licensing costs in the country for one of the most restrictive programs. And then their follow-up renewal every 2 years after that, over $300,000. This is a tremendous cost that creates unreasonable barriers to entry for business owners that want to operate in this space. And we have to work on changing those regulations to make this more of an inclusive environment. So we want to see this program expanded and made more inclusive. We think that doctors should be deciding on dosing and whether or not a patient can benefit rather than lawmakers. And we want to make sure that these decisions are being made by doctors. They're the ones who know their patients. They're the ones who understand medicine and risk and benefit. And everyone's situation is different. So we want to put that control back in the hands of doctors and let them practice medicine. Some of the other changes that we want to see: patient protections. We want to make sure that parental rights are never in jeopardy, that professional licensing is never in jeopardy, and that people aren't going to have other issues because they are legally participating in the compassionate use program. So this is a matter of catching the law up with the times and catching it up with our legal access to medical cannabis, as limited as it may be. Another really important aspect is independent laboratories. Currently, a company can test their own products, and they have state-of-the-art equipment and are doing a great job, and DPS can test them through enforcement and quality check. But there's no independent labs that are legally able to take these products and test them to ensure that they're free from contamination, that what's on the label is in fact what's in the bottle. And I have every faith in the operators right now. They have everything to lose and have operated with incredible integrity while they've been in business. But from a public policy standpoint, and as we move forward with a more robust compassionate use program, we need that element of consumer protection that can only come from an independent lab testing these products. And not just one lab, many labs should be able to do this. And then another point we need to make as far as changes, and this comes back to doctors, protecting doctors. Our current policy requires doctors to prescribe cannabis. This is something that has been talked about, and courts have ruled in other states over the last, 25 years almost 25 years since the first medical cannabis program was established. And what they've decided is that a doctor can't prescribe a Schedule I drug, but they can recommend it. Recommendations are protected free speech, and a doctor can certify a patient. And that's a formal process that goes through the state. The Compassionate Use Registry is how it would work, but it's not technically a formal prescription. A doctor writing a prescription for a Schedule I drug could potentially jeopardize their registration with the DEA, which is how they're able to prescribe any drugs to any of their patients. So we have seen some doctors have this come and take it attitude, challenging the federal government, and I'm grateful for them and the courage with which they're approaching this issue. But more doctors would be willing to participate and have these conversations with their patients if there wasn't such a significant burden because of the federal government's failing policies. Our state policy can be enacted in a way that protects them and allows them to do what's right for their patients. An overwhelming majority of Texans want to see these laws change. We see here that only 14% of Texans want to see the status quo maintained. We have to move forward with what the people of Texas want to see enacted. And events like this are intended to help those millions of Texans, including those of you participating today, help you to get engaged in the process and vocalize your support for reform. So let's shift gears and talk about legalizing adult use. Marijuana prohibition has been a failure by every measure. It doesn't keep drugs away from kids. It doesn't reduce rate of use. It doesn't reduce any rates of substance abuse that people are concerned with. Again, it's been a failure by every measure. Even the most altruistic of intentions are just not being met by by prohibiting this substance that we know there's a demand for, and therefore there will always be a supply. What we've seen is, currently we live in a black market in Texas. That means cannabis from other states, other countries is being shipped in here to meet the demand. What we'd rather see is a legal market where legitimate business owners in the state of Texas are able to operate freely. They're able to provide safe products that have been tested, that they're labeled properly. We know that this substance is objectively safer than alcohol, tobacco, many of the pharmaceutical drugs that patients are prescribed every day. And not that any of those substances should be illegal, they simply should be regulated appropriately, cannabis included. In addition to those good reasons for repealing prohibition, we also know that this is going to save money, not only on the front end by not arresting people and spending time prosecuting them, but we also see revenue in other states bringing in billions of dollars that can be used for education, for health, for an array of issues within our state. And when we're facing such significant budget shortfalls because of out of control spending, first of all, but also because of the crisis that we faced this year, we're going to have conversations about moving forward with this type of policy. We've already seen the chair of the Ways and Means Committee having this conversation, the Speaker of the House, the Comptroller, all making comments about how this issue, of course, they may not support it as conservatives, is what they say, but it's on the table. It's there for the conversation. And this is where we come in as advocates to make sure that they're getting the right information, that they're not falling for the reefer madness type propaganda that we see coming out of states like Colorado with many of their law enforcement agencies, with the Rocky Mountain high intensity drug trafficking area. Rocky Mountain HIDTA is known for putting out a report that really cherry picks information and tries to create a doomsday image for what's going on in Colorado, when in reality, they're bringing in millions or billions of dollars in tax revenue. They're arresting fewer people. They have reduced the size of the black market by 70%. And that means there's less violence. That means there's more freedom. And that is the approach that we want to take here in Texas. I think it's also important to note that we have so many people that are being arrested, so much of our resources being put into arresting people for possession. Meanwhile, 90% of burglaries in our state are going unsolved. just 10% get solved, and we're still arresting tens of thousands of people every year. We have to get our priorities straight, and thankfully more and more lawmakers and people across the state are having this conversation. I also want to note that, of course, we're talking about legalization now, and both the sheriffs and the police chiefs associations have stated that they are opposed to legalization. Again, this is where we come in to start having conversations and bringing them on board. But they were divided on decriminalization. The police chiefs agreed that reducing penalties for low-level possession is something that would benefit our communities. And so we are glad to see the Police Chiefs Association of Texas come on board with decriminalization. We're seeing individual retired law enforcement officers coming forward to talk about the burden that these laws place on our system. And there certainly is a better way forward. So we've talked a little bit about this. Overwhelmingly, people want to see these laws changed. We could generate up to $1 billion per biennium. Again, this wouldn't fill the budgetary gap that we're experiencing, but it would help. And that's what we have to be having a conversation about, is what's going to help to fill the budget there. So let's get into the general election, and then Jax is going to come back and we're going to talk about what to expect with the legislative session, which begins in January. But first, we have this general election, and this is how we're going to decide who is making the decisions during that legislative session. Just to reiterate again, I see a typo here, and I apologize for that. October 5th is the deadline to register to vote. October 5th, you have to be registered to vote to participate in the 2020 general election. Early voting has been extended. It's going to be from October 13th through the 30th. They're doing that to make sure that the crowds are kept to a minimum, so it's a safer environment going to vote in person. And then election day is Tuesday, November 3rd. So registering to vote, again, I apologize for this typo on October 3rd. It's actually October 5th is the deadline. And if you go to votetexas.gov, you can find out exactly how to register to vote, finding information about ways to register, where you do that. Every county is a little bit different, but this hub, this website will help get you exactly where you need to go. Again, this is votetexas.gov, where you'll find information about registering to vote. And your polling locations. During early voting, you can vote anywhere throughout the county, but on election day, you may or may not be able to do that. You know, in Travis County, for example, you can vote anywhere, and Harris as well. But there are counties throughout the state of Texas where you have to vote in your precinct. If you go again to votetexas.gov and you find out where to vote, it'll give you a link to your county and you can find your precinct precisely. And doing that now when you have plenty of time to prepare is going to be best, so that you don't feel so overwhelmed if this isn't something that you're familiar with doing already. Voter identification is something that is important if you want to vote, bringing valid forms of ID like your driver's license, your Texas issued ID card. A Texas handgun license would also fulfill those needs. So here's the variety of valid forms of ID. There are also opportunities and exceptions that can be made if you have verifying documentation. So I want to encourage you, if you're concerned about voter ID and if you're not sure if you have what you need, to follow the URL here, votetexas.gov/FAQ, and they have lots of answers to questions as well as links to information about voter identification. Now, I want to touch on vote by mail just briefly. It has been somewhat of a controversy across the country and here in Texas. There are lawsuits pending, and it's difficult to say exactly how everything is going to fall at the end of the day. However, what we do know is there are certain people who are already qualified to vote by mail. They call it absentee voting here in Texas, and this is when you are going to be away from your county for election day and during early voting if you're sick or disabled and not able to participate in person. If you're over the age of 65, you're eligible to vote by mail automatically. Or if you happen to be in jail. I doubt that you're watching this if you're in jail, but if you have any friends who are victims of the war on drugs and you want to make sure that they know that they can vote, then please, by all means, make sure that they can do so. Again, more information at votetexas.gov. We are so grateful to work with Texas Normal on the voter guide. They founded the voter guide in 2012, and we've been working together since 2016 to survey the candidates seeking to represent us in the Texas legislature. We expanded it this time around, and we surveyed congressional candidates as well. We did a round of surveys in the primary, so you could see where the Democrats and Republicans stood. And now we're opening it up, and we have surveyed the candidates, the Democrats, Republicans, and the Libertarians who are running for office here in Texas. We've asked them where they stand on decriminalization, on states' rights when it comes to making state policy and letting the federal government get out of the way, medical cannabis, and legalization. So in addition to the survey responses from all of the candidates, we also have voting records for incumbents. This is very important because oftentimes we hear from them what they want us to hear, and then we have to follow up and see how did they vote? How did they actually fall on this issue when it came down to it? And so we've included voting records for all incumbents who are seeking re-election. Pay attention to that when you're looking at the voter guide. This will be available by October 1st in time for registering to vote, as well as early voting. And please feel free to share this voter guide far and wide. We want to make sure that everyone has all of the information they need to elect people who are favorable to reform. Now, just briefly to touch on getting involved in the election. How can you participate other than voting? Again, share the voter guide. Make sure that all your friends and supportive family members know where the candidates stand on this issue. You can follow the candidates on social media. You can pick one that you like or follow all of them. And whenever issues come up that are relevant to cannabis, you can comment on the things that they're posting. You can share information with them. Please remember to always be respectful as you would in person, and take this opportunity to share links to resources. We have the vast World Wide Web at our disposal, and we can provide links to research, to news articles, anything that you think would be helpful. Provide that backup information. And remember that you're not only trying to influence the person you're talking to, but you're leaving resources there for everyone who sees that thread, anyone who comes and checks out the conversation. And you may be surprised that there are people who are watching and learning and taking those resources, even if they're not commenting or engaging with your interactions there. Attend virtual campaign events. Some of them are starting to do in-person events that are socially distanced, where people are wearing masks, but a lot of them are still doing digital town halls, virtual events. And you, by following them on social media or signing up for their email list, you'll get a notification about that, and you can participate. Bring up cannabis as an important issue. Talk about your personal or professional experience and why it's so important to you. Make this a topic that they have to talk about on the campaign trail. And then when you find a candidate that you like, go and volunteer. You can phone bank or maybe block walk if you're comfortable doing that. It's finally starting to cool down in Texas and getting a little more comfortable to do that. But those kinds of volunteer opportunities are relationship building opportunities, not only with the candidate who you hope to be elected and serve in the legislature, but oftentimes campaign staff doubles as legislative staff. So after they're done with the campaign, they go and they work in the Capitol. And wouldn't it be great to have a friendly face in that office that you can schedule a meeting with and have a sit-down conversation about these policies? So now I want to welcome Jax back to talk about the legislative session coming up beginning in January. Welcome back, Jax.
All right, thank you, Heather. Now let's move and talk about the legislative session. I'm going to go ahead and bring up my slides. Just one moment. All right. Here we go. 87th Texas Legislative Session. So what I want to do first before I get into how the legislative session works is just kind of give a brief recap of what happened last session. So first of all, as you probably know, our session meets every 2 years in the odd numbered years for 140 days. Last session, there was a record number of bills introduced, as Heather mentioned, 63, about decriminalization, legalization, medical access, affirmative defense. Through the work of Heather and myself, we were able to stimulate thousands of calls and emails. So you guys were putting in the time, making sure that you knew how to be engaged, and that was extremely important. We also had hundreds of Texans at the Capitol for their lobby day, which was on a Tuesday in the middle of the week, in the middle of the day. So that is very impressive to have so many people. I think it might have been one of the bigger lobby days at session. We also hosted the educational exhibits that you saw. We held legislative briefings. We put resource materials together, including committee binders, and we also hosted direct actions. First, we did them every 2 weeks, and then we did them every week. Out of the session, we were able to get 2 bills to pass, the Texas Hemp program that I discussed and the limited expansion that Heather discussed. There were some interim charges that were assigned. Interim charges, the interim is in between the end of one legislative session and the beginning of the next. That's the interim. And during them, they are charged with hearings on different topics. So one was to define intractable neurodegenerative disorder, which was a new condition added to the program that has been completed and defined. There was also one for monitoring and making recommendations regarding the vaping crisis, also known as EVALI, that is currently paused. There was also one about implementation of the hemp program. Right now, that is on hold, and we are hoping that they will be able to do something about that before the session. We're not really sure what's going to happen with that because, as I said, since they're on hold due to the pandemic, we're hoping that they're going to find some protocols that will allow them to host these before the session so that that important information that these legislators need to have are available to them. So legislative process, this is our monopoly board, if you will, of how a bill becomes a law in the state of Texas. As I mentioned, 140 days for this to happen. So Heather walked you through the electoral process, and she mentioned that election day is on November 3rd. Well, just 6 days later, on November the 9th, they will be pre-filing bills. So these are bills that are being filed before the official day of the session. Once a bill is filed, whether pre-filed or on time, you'll see, I'm going to start at the very top where it says the bill and introduce legislation. So this shows the general movement of a bill, which is typically from the House, which is the larger chamber and does some deeper digging and vetting, to the Senate, where they have more of a high profile view of it, and then move it through to the governor's desk. So in the House, you have a legislator author a bill. Once it has been authored, it is assigned to a committee. And let me also just note, at any point in time, if the next step doesn't happen by the session, the bill will die. So for example, if the bill was authored but never assigned to a committee, it would not proceed forward, right? So all of these are assuming that we go to the next step. So that committee chair will schedule a hearing for that bill. And that public hearing will be held. That will allow for public testimony, also expert testimony. And many people think that at the hearing itself, they will vote on if the bill advances to the next phase, but actually they vote on dockets of bills. So usually it's once every week, they vote on a batch of bills from the previous week to move them forward. So just to set that expectation, if you participate in a hearing, there won't be a vote that day. It will be at a later point in time. Then that bill will move forward and have a committee report, and it will go to the calendars committee. Now the calendars committee is kind of like the gatekeeper to the House floor. They up, down decide if a bill will be scheduled for debate on the House floor. So let's assume that our bill is scheduled. It will move to the House floor. It'll go through several readings, some debates, opportunities for amendment, and then it will be voted on. And if it passes out of the House, it will move on to the Senate. It goes through a similar process in the Senate. The lieutenant governor in this case assigns these committees, or I'm sorry, the bills to committees. Well, those committees will host the hearings, as I mentioned before, and then they'll vote on them at a later date. Assuming it moves forward, it goes through a very similar to the calendars committee on the Senate side, where it's scheduled for debate on the Senate floor. Now, just to set an expectation, by this point in the process, a lot of vetting, a lot of hearings, a lot of information, a lot of stakeholders, have discussed this, and so they generally know if the votes are in place or not for a bill to move forward. So it's most common practice that a bill is scheduled for the floor if they believe that they have all of the votes. And so you don't normally see substantive heated debate on the Senate floor. You do see people making statements to get it on the record, but in general, if it's making it to the House floor, they're fairly confident that they're going to be voting it into law, or voting it to move into the next position. So once it is approved by the Senate, having debate, possibilities for amendment, they vote to approve it, it lands on the governor's desk. Now the governor has 3 different options that he can choose from. He can choose to sign it into law and hold a signing ceremony like he did for the Hemp program and the Texas Compassionate Use program, or he can decide to ignore it into law, in which case it will become law on the statutory date that is included in the bill. He can also choose to veto it. Now, a veto can be reversed or overridden by a 2/3 majority vote in the chambers. That can be very difficult to do because typically, if he's going to veto them, he does that right towards the end of the session, and there may not be time for that veto to take place. So that is the very high-level version of the legislative process. And so what I want to walk you through now is preparing for interacting with your legislators, whether it be a call or an email or a visit. You know, the first thing that you have to do, which again, we're going to have those links in that document. So you're going to find all of this underneath the 87th legislative portion. You'll find some links there. Who represents you? You need to know your Texas state senator and your Texas representative. The worksheet that is linked in that document, you can print it out and make all these notes of their office address, both in district, which is the district, it's right where you live, and also the Capitol office, which will be here in Austin at the Capitol building. You'll want to make note of their phone numbers and their emails. And while you're looking at that, there are some links that you can click, usually about, you know, what committees do they sit on, learn a little bit about their biography, maybe find what types of bills they've authored in the past. My Texas Legislature Online is a super interactive platform that the government's created, probably one of the better ones that I've seen. And it's very easy for you to go and do this research on your legislators. So now that you've got that information, you can prepare, make a call, set that up, and you've got your time. You call, you'll probably talk to a staffer, you'll introduce yourself, you know, tell them that you want to make a meeting. And while you're waiting for that meeting to happen, you'll prepare. So what you want to prepare is an introduction with talking points. You want it to be personal without maybe being overwhelming, because I do know that some of these stories are very heartfelt, but we also have to make sure that we are getting our points in, and we want to make sure that you are making the most of the visit, if you will. So once you have on the sheet, you'll see there's like the 3 talking points that you want to make, your little introduction, maybe making some connections, some personal connections between you and the legislator, and also bring resource material if you plan. If you have a condition perhaps that's helped by cannabis, make sure you print out a few copies of those, bring that with your 1-page testimonial, which will have information about crafting your testimony in just a moment. It's also really important to remain polite and professional. Even if you don't receive the responses you want during these meetings. These are our elected officials, and these first meetings are sometimes, you know, kind of like a first date. We're building a relationship, and so we don't have to have them on board with everything on the first day, but we do need to make sure by being professional and courteous that we leave that door open for further conversation. And also making sure that we express gratitude for their time and their service to the district. Whether you voted for them or not, whether you support them or not, these legislators spend a lot of time up at the Capitol. They are paid between $5,000 and $7,000 every 2 years or every year for their service, their 140 days up at the Capitol. And so it's important that we recognize that it's not the most lucrative job, but it is something that they're deciding to do. And then after the meeting, make sure that you follow up as needed. I typically like to follow up with the resources that we discussed. You know, it can be hard to keep track of papers, documents, all that kind of stuff, but a quick little search in your email and you can find all of those attachments that you have sent to them. So a few highlights on etiquette. There's also a sheet there that you can print out and review later. Of course, dress professionally. You know, like if you're going to church or a business interview, just address, you know, as you would like to be presented. You have about, 5 to 10 minutes early arrival is usually a good thing. I know sometimes unexpected things can happen, and then that way we're not late. You have everything prepared, like I spoke about before. And whenever you want to talk to your legislator about your concerns, prepare with, some counterpoints to common misconceptions, which we also have a link to, mythbusters and different misconceptions that people have, and that way that you're prepared for that. Excuse me. But I also want to say, if they ask you a question that you're not really able to answer or comfortable answering, I don't know is a really great response, and it's totally okay to answer that, but just say, I don't know, I'd really love to look that up and follow up with some resources for you. And this is a great reason not only to follow up, so now you get to talk to them again and build that relationship, but also to make sure that they start looking at you maybe as a resource or someone that they can lean into on some of this information. I think I kind of covered, courteous, respectful, simply state your purpose, represent yourself as a constituent, and make sure that you thank them. When you're writing a letter, always use their full and proper title that they have. If they're a committee chairperson, make sure that you, call them chairperson or representative senator. However, I will say, don't be rude. Don't be rude. Nobody likes that. It's not a good impression. It's not relationship building. It's not creating a line of conversation. And of course, we have to behave in a manner that would behoove changing what the stereotypes are often seen as. And if you say you're going to follow up with information you don't, that shows a lack of reliability, and it definitely will not reflect well. So just these kind of simple, basic things are sometimes easy to forget in the moment, and it's just good to be reminded and to be thinking about those before we move forward. So let's talk a little bit about what to expect in the next session. So I know that, oh, I'm sorry, one second. All right. So what to expect in the session. With the pandemic, we have seen some of these interim charges paused and postponed till later. And so I know that they are working on what are they going to do to ensure that legislators and constituents and lobbyists and all of the people that come up to the Capitol are safe. I know that they are installing some dividers on the diocese. They're coming up with different opportunities for using larger areas for hearing rooms, maybe where they bring back small batches into the actual hearing room at a time. There may also be a virtual component to it, which we have not had in past sessions. So that's going to be very interesting to see how this rolls out. Of course, we always encourage calls and emails. You'll still be able to do that. You might be able to make a Zoom meeting or a Zoom visit with these legislators. So as we learn a little bit more about that, it's going to be really important that you stay tuned in. And so to that end, we've got a workshop that we're going to be hosting that's going to be totally dedicated to the legislative session. It's going to be as we get closer, but I do want to go over some of the different events that are coming up. You'll see it under the events section of the quick links document that I was talking about. And there's quite a few dates with links so that you can register, find out more information. And we'll start with registering to vote. It is the deadline to register to vote on October 5th. Make sure that you get it done early. Heather touched on some of the unforeseen conditions and issues with this election this session, so make sure you do that. We've also got the foundation is working with a student from the University of Maryland regarding a Texas patient study on medical cannabis, and you can participate in that until October 6th. So go to our website and take a look at that. You'll also find a link to the Central Texas Candidate Forum on marijuana policy. That's going to be on October the 7th at 8 p.m. Then early voting will be from October 13th through the 30th. And on during that time frame, there's also going to be the Texas Veteran Cannabis Conference. That is a conference where we're going to be getting a hemp update from Commissioner Miller regarding how the hemp program is rolling out. We're also going to be learning from doctors about THC as medicine, pain and PTSD with cannabis, a Cannabis 101 for everybody. And we'll also have a pharmacist who's going to discuss some prescription and cannabis interactions that we should watch out for. We'll also have 2 panels. So you can register for that. Anybody is welcome to participate. And that is going to be on the 17th of October at 10 a.m. Then you have general election on November 3rd. Pre-filing will start on November 6th. And then from November 20th to 21st, Texans for Responsible Marijuana Policy will be hosting their annual conference. It's going to be all online, and it's the Texas Marijuana Policy Conference. You'll find a link there as well. Then on January 12th, it's actually going to be the first day of the legislative session, and we're going to kick the session off right with a workshop like I was telling you. It'll be a workshop where we're going to discuss what to expect out of a hearing in the legislative session because it is going to be a very different situation than we are used to. I want to share also our contact information with you so that you can reach out to either of us if you have any questions or want to follow up on anything. So I want to just take this opportunity to thank everyone for participating in our workshop. It's been wonderful to travel the state for so many years and meet many of you. I wish I could see you all in person, but I do appreciate you participating in this virtual conference.